Ireland is in the midst of a housing crisis that has reshaped the nation's social fabric, distorted its economy, and eroded opportunities for an entire generation. You don't need official reports to see it. You see it in adults in their 30s and 40s still living in childhood bedrooms. You see it in families staying in hotel rooms used as emergency housing. And you see it very clearly in the sky-high rents, which now consumes more of people's wages than almost anywhere else in Western Europe. This crisis didn't appear suddenly. It built up slowly as different parts of Ireland's housing system began failing. The obvious problem is that we are not building enough homes. But the deeper issue is that the entire complex system, made up of elements such as planning, infrastructure, government policies, a fragmented construction industry, have not been optimised to enable Ireland to build at full capacity. Ireland once had one of the highest home ownership rates in Europe. In the early 1990s it was around 80%. Today, among adults under 40, it's closer to one-third. Around 500,000 adults still live with their parents. And homelessness has reached record highs, with nearly 17,000 people in emergency accommodation. There was no single event or one disastrous policy. Instead, several long-term failures converged. The reduction of state-built housing, the collapse in construction capacity, severely constrained water infrastructure, rising costs, planning delays, dereliction, fragmented governance, a labour shortage, and projects which make no financial sense. Each problem alone would strain the system due to a series of interdependencies. Combined, they produce a market that struggles with the most basic requirement, delivering enough homes for the people who live in Ireland. This video breaks down those structural failures one by one. What went wrong, how the problems interact, and why the crisis can't be solved without major system-wide reform. Ireland's housing crisis starts with a simple imbalance. The population has grown rapidly, while housing construction has collapsed. Ireland has been one of the fastest growing countries in Europe. Some of that growth is natural, but the majority of that share comes from immigration and Ireland's emergence as a global tech and services hub. Ireland's population growth in 2024 was roughly 100,000 people, with the majority of this coming from net migration of roughly 80,000 people. Within the immigration numbers, there are a significant number of refugees entering Ireland. As per the CSO, Ireland has issued almost 114,000 PPS numbers to Ukrainians, with a similar number now living in Ireland. In the first half of 2024, Ireland saw a spike of 94% in the numbers seeking asylum. It is estimated there are 33,000 international protection applicants being provided with accommodation. Over the last 2 decades, tens of thousands of people moved to Ireland for jobs and stability, a major factor in Ireland's economic success. But while population surged, construction plummeted. In the mid-2000s, Ireland was building close to 90,000 homes a year. After the crash, output collapsed and never fully recovered. Today, annual completions sit closer to 30,000. Demand rose sharply, just as supply fell dramatically. Behind this collapse are deeper structural problems. A construction industry that never regained its former workforce or capacity. A planning system that moves slowly and unpredictably. Rising land, labour and material costs, and critically, water and wastewater networks that are frequently at or beyond capacity. You can't build homes without access to drinking water and wastewater treatment. This widening gap between population growth and housing supply is the foundation of Ireland's crisis. And one of the biggest hidden constraints, the one that stops thousands of otherwise viable homes before they ever reach planning, is the country's ageing water infrastructure. One of the biggest barriers to building homes in Ireland is something most people never see: water and wastewater infrastructure. It's an invisible constraint that quietly blocks development across the country, and in many areas it's the single largest bottleneck in the entire housing system. Ireland's water network is old, fragmented and historically underfunded. For decades the system simply wasn't built for a modern, fast-growing population. As demand increased, the network remained largely unchanged. Today the consequences are severe. Massive leakage. Ireland loses an extraordinary amount of treated drinking water through leaks. Nearly half of clean, treated water disappears before reaching a home. For comparison, Irish leakage is almost double that of the UK. This doesn't just waste water, it limits supply. Dublin, for example, already runs its drinking water network very close to full capacity, which puts a cap on additional demand, water quality and wastewater failures. Some drinking water supplies remain vulnerable to contamination, with boil water notices affecting thousands of households in recent years. Several treatment plants still struggle to meet EU standards. Wastewater is an even bigger issue. Ireland has repeatedly faced EU legal action because dozens of plants are outdated, overloaded, or in some cases were still discharging raw sewage into rivers and coasts. As recently as 2015, more than 40 urban centres were doing exactly that. When the water infrastructure is at close to full capacity, houses can't be built. When a network can't cope, Uisce Éireann issues a stop notice, a moratorium on connecting new homes. Entire towns or suburbs can be effectively frozen until upgrades are completed. This means land zoned for housing cannot be used. Planning permissions that look good on paper cannot proceed. Developers often face the cost of funding local upgrades themselves, which is completely unviable for smaller builders. This is one of the key reasons why thousands of planning permissions never turn into actual homes, and the problem isn't spread evenly through the country. Some areas are more heavily affected than others, meaning the housing crisis directly linked to poor water infrastructure will affect some areas more than others. Mega projects take decades. Ireland's flagship fix, the Eastern and Midlands Water Supply Project, drawing from the Shannon, is one of the largest infrastructure investments in the state's history. But large-scale water projects take decades to deliver, and until they arrive, the bottleneck remains. Ireland can streamline planning, modernise construction, and subsidise development, but none of it matters if the water and wastewater system beneath the ground cannot support new homes. But water isn't the only invisible system holding back Ireland's housing supply. There's another bottleneck, one you don't see when you walk past a new estate, but one that can leave finished homes sitting dark and empty. Electricity. Ireland doesn't just have a housing crisis, it has an electricity crisis hiding underneath it. Across the country, entire housing estates are being built, but people can't move in. Not because the homes aren't finished, but because there simply isn't enough capacity on the electricity grid to connect them. Over the last decade, Ireland has become a magnet for data centres, massive warehouses of servers that power the cloud, streaming, social media, and AI. These facilities use extraordinary amounts of electricity. Some consume as much power as a medium-sized town. Ireland has seen an increase in the number of data centres being set up here. Ireland hosts roughly 80 to 90 data centres. At the same time, Ireland continues to build new houses. But the grid wasn't upgraded fast enough to handle both. So now we have a situation where developers finish houses, buyers get their keys, and then they're told they can't move in because there's no electricity connection available. In some areas, new housing projects are being delayed for months or even years, waiting for network upgrades. This isn't a technical glitch, it's a planning failure. For years, Ireland's energy strategy assumed that economic growth would fund future infrastructure, but the infrastructure never arrived in time. The result? Ireland has homes without power. Until critical national infrastructure is upgraded, the country risks building houses that no one can live in, not just because we can't build them, but because we forgot to keep the lights on. To understand today's housing crisis, you have to look at what the state stopped doing. For much of the 20th century, Ireland had a strong tradition of public house building. From the 1930s to the 1970s, local authorities delivered large numbers of social homes. By 1961, nearly 1 in 5 households lived in council housing. That model was dismantled gradually. Starting in the late 1970s, policy shifted away from directly building homes and towards relying on the private market. Instead of constructing new housing, the state increasingly funded people to rent from private landlords through schemes like rent supplement, housing assistance payment, approved housing bodies. The government then introduced the tenant purchase scheme. The tenant purchase scheme had a long-term impact on the stock of public housing. Tenants could buy their council homes at 40% to 60% discounts of market prices, which was often below replacement cost, and much of the revenue wasn't reinvested into replacing the units sold. Between 1990 and 2016, nearly half of all newly built council homes were eventually sold off. The decline in state-led building is stark. In 1985, the state built 6,900 social homes. By 2015, that number had fallen to just 75. When the state steps back from building, two things happen. One, the supply of social housing shrinks, pushing up waiting lists. Two, the state becomes a major customer in the private market, competing with ordinary buyers. This drives prices up and reduces the supply available to everyone else. Because the state no longer builds enough homes, it increasingly relies on readily available temporary or short-term solutions. For example, rent supplements to those in private rentals or hotels, and B&Bs for those in need of emergency accommodation. As per a report by the ESRI, in 2020, almost 300,000 households received support for their housing costs. This accounts for 54% of those renting. The HAP scheme has taken 53,000 rental properties off the private market. Overall, HAP expenditure from 2014 to 2023 was just under €3 billion. This is an incredible sum of money spent on just access to accommodation. The Committee of Public Accounts criticised HAP as a scheme that does not result in value for money for the Exchequer. In 2024, Ireland spent €361 million on emergency accommodation. That is equivalent to building around 900 new three-bed homes every year. The same funding could have provided permanent accommodation for between 2,700 and 5,400 people. Possibly even more using modular homes. It makes no economic sense. Worse, 86% of all homelessness spending now goes to temporary accommodation, not on permanent housing. This is taxpayers' money that disappears annually instead of creating long-term assets. The structural shift: Ireland didn't simply underfund housing, it changed strategy. It moved from building social housing to buying access to it. Once that shift happened, the system became dependent on the private market, a market already strained by high costs, slow planning, and limited capacity. Instead of stabilising the housing system by directly providing social housing, the state became one more buyer in an already overheated market. This only made things worse for Ireland. And the consequences of that shift cascade through every other part of the housing crisis and the tourism industry. Once the state stopped building social housing at scale, the responsibility didn't disappear, it shifted to private developers. Under Part 5 of the Planning and Development Act, up to 20% of units in new developments must be provided to the state for social or affordable housing at a discounted price. When land gains value through planning permission, the planning gain, a portion of that uplift returns to the public. But it has negative consequences. Developers don't get a discount on building costs. A Part 5 unit costs exactly the same to build as any other home, same materials, same labour, same time, and the same regulations. Yet the developer must sell these units to the state at a reduced price. That reduction behaves like a tax on the project, a cost that has to be absorbed somewhere. In high-value areas it works, elsewhere it doesn't. In parts of Dublin or other expensive locations, margins can absorb Part 5. But many developments in Ireland operate on very thin margins because of high construction costs, expensive finance, slow, unpredictable planning, and infrastructure constraints. In these borderline projects, even a small reduction in revenue can shift a scheme from viable to unviable. When the numbers don't add up, the project simply doesn't get built. The project dies even before a planning application is made, and the reason why the project didn't happen is not recorded as part of any data set. This results in a paradox. Part 5 is intended to deliver social and affordable housing, but by reducing profitability, it can reduce the total supply of homes delivered in Ireland. Fewer homes means more pressure on rents, more households needing supports, more demand for social housing. It becomes circular. The issue is that Ireland relies heavily on private, profit-driven developers to deliver what used to be a core state function. When costs are high and risks unpredictable, the financial calculations clash with government policy goals. The bigger structural point. In Ireland's current system, where viability is fragile and costs are high, even well-designed policies can unintentionally suppress supply. And the next bottleneck developers face is navigating Ireland's slow, complex and legally risky planning process. Ask anyone involved in building homes in Ireland where projects get stuck, and you'll hear the same answer. Planning. The problem isn't just that it's slow, it's that the system is unpredictable, fragmented and high risk, making development expensive long before construction even starts. Subjective standards slow everything down. Instead of clear numeric rules, many key decisions rely on subjective terms like amenity, character, design excellence. These concepts matter, but they mean different things to different planners. Two identical proposals can receive completely different decisions depending on the local authority or even the individual case officer. Countries with mostly numeric rules, height limits, density thresholds, setbacks, deliver planning far more predictably. In Ireland, small and large projects alike can get tied up in months of reports and discretionary judgments. 31 local authorities means 31 different planning systems. Every local authority has its own development plan, preferred design approaches, documentation requirements, and internal interpretations of national policy. A development in Galway faces a different set of expectations than one in Cork or Donegal. The complexity in a planning application can be overwhelming. During a Doyle debate, one planning application was cited as having 30,000 pages which had to be delivered using a van. The system simply isn't built for speed. Judicial reviews, the biggest wild card. Even approved projects can be frozen for years because of something called a judicial review in the High Court. Basically, anyone affected by the build can challenge it. And here is the catch. They often win on technicalities, not because the project is actually bad for the environment. We're talking about tiny procedural mistakes in environmental assessments, habitat rules, coastal or river impacts, or even wildlife surveys. It's not really about protecting nature, it's about navigating a legal minefield. One small paperwork error can undo years of work. Notable cases affected by objections include 224 units in Killarney blocked due to concerns that artificial lighting from the development would interfere with the lesser horseshoe bat's flight paths. 657 apartments near St Anne's Park in North Dublin blocked because the impact on Brent geese and other protected bird species in Dublin Bay had not been adequately addressed. Dublin developments overturned over inadequate coastal habitat assessments. Delays to the Greater Dublin Drainage Project due to procedural failings involving the EPA landmark cases on EIA compliance affecting quarries, wind farms and large developments. Ireland gold plates EU rules. Ireland often implements EU environmental directives more strictly than other European countries and far more strictly than required. This results in larger reports, more assessments, more documentation, more procedural steps, and more opportunities for legal challenges. Every additional layer increases delays, uncertainty, and cost. The consequences are predictable. When planning is slow, complex, and risky, timelines become unpredictable, developers pause or cancel projects, finance becomes more expensive, smaller builders cannot compete, overall supply falls, costs rise for everyone. Recent reforms under the Planning and Development Act 2024 aim to streamline the process, but they tweak a system whose core complexity remains. And one planning decision in particular, and the 2013 bedsit ban, eliminated an entire tier of low-cost housing almost overnight. In 2013, Ireland made a decision that was meant to improve living standards, but it ended up removing the cheapest housing option in the country almost overnight. The government banned traditional bedsits, forcing all rental units to have a private bathroom, proper kitchen facilities, and independent heating controls. The intention was to eliminate substandard accommodation, but policymakers underestimated what bedsits actually represented. They were the bottom rung of Ireland's rental ladder, especially for single people in cities. Thousands of low-cost units disappeared. Most bedsits were in older Georgian and Victorian buildings subdivided decades ago. Bringing them up to the new standards was either physically impossible or financially unviable, so landlords closed them instead. The result was the loss of an estimated 5,000 to 15,000 of Ireland's cheapest, most centrally located units, with Dublin hit hardest. Some were converted into larger, more expensive apartments. Others simply left the rental market entirely. Single renters felt it most. Bedsits weren't meant to be high-quality homes, they were supposed to be affordable. When they vanished, single people were pushed into more expensive house shares. As a result, houses became less available for families. In many cases, people who could have afforded a small bedsit were instead pushed into emergency accommodation. The cost to the state exploded. The disappearance of low-cost rentals fed directly into rising homelessness. Emergency accommodation spending rose sharply. Local authorities spent a staggering €2.2 billion between 2014 and 2023, a period in which the number of households in emergency accommodation grew by 224%. In Dublin, the cost jumped from €455,000 in 2012 to nearly €118 million in 2018. This money could have provided long-term, small units, instead went into short-term nightly rates. The bedsit ban improved accommodation standards, but in a system already short on affordable supply, it removed the lowest cost option without replacing it. It didn't lift people up the housing ladder, it removed the first step. Ireland's cities are full of Georgian and Victorian buildings located in some of the best areas in the country. Many of these could provide thousands of central walkable homes. But once a building is designated a protected structure, converting it into apartments becomes extremely difficult, often impossible. Fire safety standards, the biggest barrier. Modern apartment fire regulations require 60-minute fire-rated walls and floors between units, fire-rated doors, sealed cavities, protected escape routes. But Georgian and Victorian buildings were built with timber floors and partitions, open cavities, decorative internal layouts, narrow and winding staircases. To meet modern standards, you would typically need to replace or heavily reinforce floors, rebuild partitions, add new escape routes, install barriers or sprinklers. Yet many of these interventions are prohibited or tightly restricted because they would damage the building's historical fabric. This creates a direct contradiction. The upgrades needed for safety are exactly the upgrades the conservation rules prevent. Energy efficiency restrictions. Add another layer. Protected structures must retain features like original timber, sash windows, original facades, internal architectural elements. External insulation is almost always banned, while internal insulation is limited. Thicker insulation risks condensation and structural damage. Even if a conversion were allowed, heating costs would be very high. The result? Vacancy, underuse, or commercial use. Because compliant conversions are so expensive and constrained, owners often choose alternatives. Keep the building for offices or commercial use. Leave it partially vacant. Allow it to slide into dereliction because refurbishment is unaffordable. This is why central Dublin contains thousands of underused or vacant units in historic buildings, exactly where housing demand is highest. Other countries take a different approach. Across the United Kingdom and continental Europe, a fundamental paradigm shift has redefined fire safety standards. This is the implementation of performance-based fire engineering. This methodology moves away from the prescriptive, inflexible checklist adherence that previously dominated building codes. Instead, it mandates a rigorous assessment of inherent risk specific to the structure and its occupancy. This focus on objective safety outcomes allows for necessary design flexibility, enabling engineers to utilize sophisticated bespoke solutions. This performance-driven framework ensures that fire safety measures are not merely compliant, but optimally integrated and effective. These approaches maintain safety while enabling residential conversions without destroying historic features. Ireland could adopt similar methods but has not yet done so. This is a major missed opportunity. Protected structures sit in the best located and well-serviced parts of Irish cities. But the regulatory framework freezes much of this housing potential. Thousands of possible homes remain locked behind a set of rules that make conversion risky, slow, or financially impossible. Ireland's construction sector isn't dominated by large industrial-scale builders. It's the opposite. It's one of the most fragmented industries in Europe. Over 95% of construction companies are SMEs, many small family-run firms employing fewer than 250 people and often fewer than 10. This structure shapes everything about how Ireland builds. Small firms equals small scale equals high costs. In larger countries, big developers can standardise designs, bulk purchase materials, use prefabricated components, and invest in new technology. In Ireland, most builders operate on small bespoke projects with little standardisation. That means no bulk buying power, inconsistent productivity, variable quality, higher per unit costs, and limited innovation. Even before planning or land costs are considered, homes in Ireland start more expensive simply because the industry lacks scale. Ireland imports more building materials than you'd expect. Despite being a major exporter of raw timber, Ireland still imports large volumes of processed timber, steel, bricks, and prefabricated panels. Imports expose the industry to global inflation, shipping delays, Brexit-related friction, geopolitical shocks. When world markets fluctuate, Irish construction costs rise quickly. Modern construction methods are rare. Globally, construction is shifting to modular and prefabricated methods. They reduce construction time by 40 to 60% and cost by 10 to 30%. Sweden, for example, builds 80 to 84% of its detached homes using prefabricated methods. Ireland's adoption is minimal. So why is this the case? Modern methods require consistent demand, large-scale pipelines, standardized designs, big upfront investment. Small firms cannot absorb that risk. Planning unpredictability also makes long-term investment unattractive. The result is a system stuck in traditional, labour-intensive building which can be affected by the weather. One example of Ireland's inability to adopt modern building is Modern Homes Ireland, a modular manufacturer. It shut down due to inconsistent demand. Innovation cannot survive without scale. Modern construction methods have a structural catch-22. Ireland can't scale prefab because the industry is fragmented. Because the industry is fragmented, small construction firms can't absorb the risk or the current costs associated implementing new modern construction methods. Therefore, modular remains expensive because demand is low. It's a circular problem that keeps delivery slow and costly. This is an area a state construction company can make a big difference. Given the fragmentation, the argument could be made that a state-led builder could guarantee long-term demand, stabilise modular production, train SMEs in modern methods, bulk purchase materials, and build at a scale the private market cannot achieve. Countries like Austria, Finland, and Singapore have used state-led building to modernise their industries and deliver affordable homes efficiently. Ireland could do the same, but hasn't. The big picture. Ireland doesn't just have a shortage of housing, it has a capacity shortage. The construction sector responsible for solving the crisis is structurally incapable of building modern homes at the speed, scale, or cost required. Until that changes, every other reform becomes harder. Next comes another major constraint: finding enough workers to build the homes Ireland needs. Ireland's housing crisis isn't just about planning or costs. At the most basic level, the country doesn't have enough construction workers to build the homes it needs. Before the 2008 crash, the construction workforce peaked at over 236,000 people. When the industry collapsed, tens of thousands left, emigrating, retraining, or exiting the sector entirely. Even as the economy recovered, the workforce never returned to its former scale. The housing crisis makes the labour shortage worse. Ireland needs foreign workers to fill the gap, but high rents make the country unattractive. If you're a carpenter, plumber, or crane operator abroad and you see that most of your Irish salary will go on rent, you simply don't move. Ireland ends up in a loop. You need workers to build homes, but you need homes to attract workers. Countries like Australia and New Zealand use low-cost worker accommodation or modular units to house tradespeople temporarily. Ireland has not pursued such options at scale. The apprenticeship system in Ireland isn't delivering enough new workers. Ireland's apprenticeship pathway struggles to bring in fresh labour. Problems with Ireland's apprenticeship system include very low starting pay, often €7 to €9 an hour, reliance on employers to provide placements, long training times, high dropout rates, and training backlogs. For mid-career adults, retraining is often financially impossible. By contrast, countries like Germany and Austria offer better pay, blended learning, and more structured vocational routes. International recruitment is harder than it should be for Ireland. Even though Ireland targets skilled trades through immigration policy, workers compare high rents, childcare costs, cost of living, and lack of affordable accommodation. Ireland offers jobs but not affordability, and workers end up going elsewhere. The impact on housing delivery. A persistent labour shortage has major consequences. Projects take longer, wages rise, productivity drops, subcontractor rates increase, and fewer homes get built each year. Unless Ireland reforms apprenticeships, expands worker accommodation, and improves recruitment incentives, the shortage becomes structural and permanent. And even with enough workers, many projects still fail due to a deeper issue. Even if a developer has land, planning permission, workers, and materials, one obstacle can still kill many projects before they begin: finance. The cost of money in Ireland is so high and the risk so significant that countless schemes become either unviable long before construction starts or are unable to get financing. Finance costs represent a significant cost in a construction project. Interest accumulates for every month a project is active. Delays caused by planning appeals, design changes, or infrastructure issues can add hundreds of thousands to the financing costs of a construction project. Industry analysis shows financing alone often accounts for 5% to 10% of a project's entire delivery cost. Before concrete is poured, the development already carries a significant financial burden. Combine this with rising land prices, expensive materials, slow planning, strict regulations, development contributions, and Part 5 obligations. The margin for error collapses. Post-2008, banks became extremely risk-averse. After the financial crisis, Irish banks retreated sharply from development lending. They demanded high levels of developer equity, more security, pre-sales commitments, and tighter risk controls. Small builders, who make up 95% of the sector, often cannot meet these requirements. Alternative lenders step in, but their rates are even higher. This created a bottleneck in housing supply. Developers had viable sites, but couldn't secure finance at reasonable conditions. Luckily, the state has tried to fill the gap. Home Building Finance Ireland, HBFI, was created to provide cheaper development finance. HBFI's role is to fill that gap, especially for small and medium-sized developers, regional projects, schemes delivering private, affordable or social housing. Not everyone in Ireland is experiencing the same housing crisis. This is because Ireland doesn't have one housing supply. The supply of housing available is determined by a person's living status, income, whether you're renting or buying, and your geographic location. At the sharpest end of Ireland's housing crisis is the dramatic rise in homelessness, underscoring how the segmented housing system fails the most vulnerable. Tens of thousands of people are now reliant on emergency accommodation, with a record of 16,766 people being regarded as homeless. However, the real figure is likely to be much higher. There were over 5,000 children accessing temporary homeless services in late 2025, many housed in hotels, B&Bs and other interim arrangements rather than stable homes. These figures represent a significant rise in homelessness over the past year and highlight long waits for social housing coupled with insufficient affordable alternatives, forcing families and individuals into unsuitable living conditions and prolonged uncertainty. Charities and advocacy groups warn that Ireland's current approach, which is heavily dependent on hotel-style emergency provision rather than permanent, secure housing, is a systemic failure that deepens trauma and instability, particularly for children. Urgent structural reforms are needed to expand social housing supply, strengthen homelessness prevention, and replace crisis responses with long-term accommodation solutions. Next is income. This is broadly split into 3 tiers. Tier 1, social housing for the lowest incomes. Eligibility varies by county, but typically around €40,000. Net household income in Dublin, €30,000 to €35,000 elsewhere. It's the most accessible tier on paper, but supply is extremely limited. Waiting lists are long, turnover is low, and decades of underbuilding mean very few new tenants are housed each year. It is estimated that the average wait time for social housing in South Dublin County was reported as being almost 10 years in 2023. Tier 2, affordable housing and cost rental for moderate incomes. This tier is aimed at people who earn too much for social housing, earn too little to buy or rent at market rates. Cost rental thresholds are roughly €66,000 net income in Dublin, €59,000 outside Dublin. The concept is a good idea, secure tenure, below market rents, but the scale is tiny compared to demand. In 2024, roughly 2,000 cost rental units were delivered. Tier 3, the open market, the squeezed middle. This is the hardest hit group. They don't qualify for supports, forced to pay high rents, struggle to purchase affordable homes, and face direct competition from investors, high earners, and the state. Ireland has a system with gaps instead of transitions. These 3 tiers don't connect smoothly. If people earn €1 over the social housing threshold, they lose access. People who qualify for cost rental can't secure a unit because supply is tiny. People in the open market face prices driven by scarcity, state, and investor dominance. The result is a segmented system where large numbers of working households fall between the gaps, too rich for support, too poor for the market. The housing crisis is also split between those trying to buy and those trying to rent. In cities, the situation is especially stark. According to Lorcan Sir of TU Dublin in 2023, 94% of new home builds were apartments, 98% of those apartments were built for rental, not sale, meaning almost no new apartments are available for ordinary people to buy. Those in the market to buy a home experience a different housing crisis than those try to rent. Developers target institutional investors because the financial model is safer and more predictable. Despite the increase in new builds to rent, the rental market is getting worse. Small landlords are leaving the market. In cities, the impact will be less given the level of new units being built to rent. But in more rural locations or in less economically viable locations, the rental market will continue to get worse. Ireland historically relied on small landlords for rental supply. That model is collapsing directly because of government regulation. When tenants fall into arrears, small landlords can face 12 to 24 months of no rent, slow residential tenancies board processes, weak enforcement, and ongoing mortgage costs. Many exit the market entirely, selling up. Each exit removes one more rental home. Ireland's rental stock falls further and rents continue to rise. But rents don't rise in a uniform manner in each county. Ireland's housing crisis isn't evenly geographically spread. Depending on where you want to purchase or rent a home, you will experience different levels of supply. According to recent data from GeoDirectory, the lowest vacancy rates in Ireland, that is empty homes, are in Dublin with 1.1% and Kildare with 1.6%. While a 2024 report by Savills highlighted counties with the lowest ratios of homes available to rent or share per 10,000 people. Monaghan ranked the lowest at 2.4 or 16 homes, and second was Roscommon at 2.5 or 18 homes. Also, house prices can vary. As per the CSO, the highest median house price was in Dublin at €492,000, while the lowest was in Donegal at €190,000. The average wage before tax in Dublin is estimated to be €49,000. This gives a price-to-wage ratio of 10 in Dublin, when a good ratio is considered to be 3 to 4, with a ratio of 5 and above considered severely unaffordable. The frustrating thing about this crisis in Ireland is the lack of supply exists alongside another contradiction: tens of thousands of homes sitting empty even as demand explodes. That brings us to dereliction and vacancy. Ireland's housing crisis has a visible contradiction. Hundreds of thousands of people can't find affordable homes, yet Irish cities are full of vacant, derelict and underused buildings. Instead of supplying badly needed homes, these properties sit idle for years. The scale of vacancy in Ireland is staggering in the context of a housing crisis. According to Census 2022, 163,000 dwellings were vacant, excluding holiday homes. Over 20,000 properties are officially listed as derelict. Even the state leaves homes empty. In 2023, Dublin City Council was one of the biggest offenders in the state. It had 712 vacant council homes. Nationwide, local authorities had 3,544 vacant units. In the middle of a housing emergency, having thousands of public units unused is unacceptable. Why are so many homes staying empty? There isn't a single cause, but several structural barriers. Speculative holding. Owners sometimes leave properties idle because rising land values make holding more profitable than renovating or selling. Weak enforcement. Councils can levy the derelict sites levy, but enforcement is inconsistent and often too slow to matter. Many owners simply ignore it. And renovation costs are high. Bringing a derelict property back into use can cost more than building new, especially when required to meet fire safety standards, disability access rules, energy efficiency regulations, and heritage conservation requirements. In many cases, the financial math simply doesn't work. CPOs are slow and bureaucratic. Compulsory purchase orders are meant to tackle persistent dereliction, but the process is lengthy, appeals can take years, councils lack staff and resources, and cases get stuck in procedural limbo. In theory, CPOs are powerful. In practice, they barely make dent the problem. Vacancy is another governance failure. This level of long-term vacancy isn't an accident, it's the product of slow legal processes, unclear accountability, under-resourced enforcement, outdated legislation, and fragmented responsibilities across public bodies. No single agency is responsible for ensuring empty homes return to use. Many derelict or vacant buildings sit in central locations, areas close to employment and transport, and places with existing infrastructure already in the ground. These are the least costly and most sustainable areas to add new homes. Reusing them would reduce urban sprawl and cut infrastructure requirements dramatically. Unlocking vacancy should be the fastest fix, but isn't. Redeveloping vacant stock should be easier than building new homes because land already exists, infrastructure is in place, environmental impact is lower, and construction timelines are shorter. But Ireland's regulatory and governance system makes reactivation one of the hardest paths. Despite the housing shortage, Ireland leaves thousands of potential homes trapped behind bureaucracy, cost barriers, and weak enforcement, even as building new homes becomes more expensive every year. Which leads straight into the next challenge, the high cost of construction itself. Even when a housing project in Ireland clears every hurdle, from land to planning to finance and labour, it is still among the most expensive in Europe to build. Almost every part of the system pushes costs upwards, and if homes remain unaffordable, the housing crisis will persist no matter how many are delivered. Material costs are high and vulnerable to global shocks. As an island, Ireland faces higher shipping and logistics costs and relies heavily on imports of timber, steel, bricks, and prefabricated components. This leaves the construction sector exposed to global inflation, supply chain disruption, and post-Brexit friction. Events like COVID and the war in Ukraine sent prices soaring, and Ireland, with limited domestic manufacturing, felt these shocks particularly hard. Labour costs are not exceptionally high by European standards, but productivity is low. The industry is fragmented, skills are inconsistent, modular construction is underused, and traditional methods still dominate. That means more labour hours, longer timelines, and higher per unit costs. Ireland also enforces some of the strictest building standards in Europe, particularly in fire safety, energy performance, ventilation, acoustic insulation, and accessibility. These standards deliver high-quality homes, but they also add layers of design, work, and compliance, require specialist materials and labour, slow down approvals and increase professional fees. On top of that, the concrete levy introduced to fund defective block remediation adds further cost. Planning delays then magnify everything. Each additional information request, appeal or judicial review increases professional fees, holding costs, redesign work, inflation exposure and financing charges. A 6-month delay can add hundreds of thousands of euro, while a delay of 1 or 2 years can wipe out a project entirely. The losses from failed schemes are then carried forward into the next viable development. There are also development contributions and infrastructure charges. Local authorities levy fees to fund roads, footpaths, parks, lighting and community facilities, while Uisce Éireann charges connection fees for water and wastewater infrastructure. These are necessary, but they are ultimately paid for in the final price of the home. Land is another major driver. In urban areas, it is extremely expensive because of slow zoning, a lack of serviced sites, infrastructure bottlenecks, dereliction, fragmented governance, and limited use of compulsory purchase powers. In Dublin, land alone can make up 30 to 40% of the total cost of a housing scheme. Chronic undersupply then locks these prices in. In a normal market, rising build costs would reduce output until prices adjusted. In Ireland, demand is so far ahead of supply that developers pass higher costs onto buyers and renters. Institutional investors absorb inflated prices, and the state itself purchases units, keeping demand elevated. Scarcity allows high prices to persist even when construction costs explode. Finally, taxes and levies quietly accumulate. A typical project faces VAT, stamp duty and Part 5 requirements for discounted units. None of these is unreasonable on its own, but together they add a significant burden. Ireland isn't just building too few homes, it is also building them in one of the most expensive ways possible. Every structural issue adds friction, land, labour, materials, finance, planning and regulation. These accumulated pressures push final prices far beyond what many households can afford. And behind many of these cost pressures lies a broader governance challenge: Ireland's highly centralised, slow-moving decision-making system. Beneath the visible problems of high costs, slow planning and limited capacity lies a deeper issue. Ireland is one of the most centralised countries in Europe. The Local Autonomy Index attempts to measure how much autonomy local governments have in terms of legislative, administrative, fiscal and other respects across 57 different countries. Of the 57 countries measured, Ireland ranks last in the EU and 51st across all countries measured. This centralisation affects how quickly the housing system can respond, how decisions are made, and how effectively local problems are solved. The central government controls almost everything in Ireland. Local authorities have limited autonomy. They rely heavily on national government for funding, approval of major projects, staffing, policy direction, and infrastructure investment. They have very restricted powers to raise revenue, borrow independently, develop local solutions, and experiment with new approaches. In practice, local authorities often function more like administrative units of central government than independent problem-solving bodies. The government's one-size-fits-all policies don't match local realities. National policies are designed for the entire country, but Ireland's housing challenges are highly varied. Dublin faces dense urban pressure. Rural counties struggle with different dynamics. Commuter counties face infrastructure and capacity constraints. Tourist regions have seasonal distortions. And border counties have cross-border influences. With little local flexibility, policies that work well in one area may fail in another. Councils cannot adapt quickly, even when the problems are obvious on the ground. This results in slow feedback loops. Effective governance requires fast feedback, rapid adjustments, and the ability to correct errors quickly. In Ireland, policies take too long to change, data moves slowly, is fragmented or non-existent. Local issues take months or years to register centrally. And councils often cannot act without national approval. This creates a national system that struggles to adapt at the pace required in a housing emergency. Centralisation creates fragmentation elsewhere. Ironically, concentrating power at the top leads to fragmentation lower down. When local bodies lack authority, national government compensates by creating new agencies and regulators to fill gaps. Over time, this has produced a crowded ecosystem of semi-state companies, regulators, oversight bodies, departmental units, and statutory agencies. Each has a narrow mandate and none has overall responsibility for delivering homes. The result is a slow, rigid system. Centralisation means local bottlenecks escalate slowly, national policies respond late, coordination breaks down, capacity isn't matched to local needs, and decision-making is sluggish even during emergencies. Ireland's governance structure lacks the agility found in countries with more empowered local authorities. And that lack of agility becomes even clearer when we look at how fragmented state agencies interact with one another in the planning and delivery process. If centralisation slows Ireland down from above, fragmentation slows it down from within. Housing delivery involves a sprawling network of state agencies, local authorities, regulators, departments and semi-state bodies, all with power, none with full responsibility. This is one of the least visible but most damaging structural problems in Ireland's housing system. Power is split across multiple agencies. Each body involved in housing has its own mandate, its own priorities, its own internal processes, and its own risk profile. And these mandates often conflict. For example, environmental agencies prioritise protection. Planning bodies focus on compliance. Infrastructure agencies prioritise capacity. And housing bodies want delivery. When one agency raises an objection, even on a narrow technical point, it can halt or reshape an entire project, even if the broader housing need is severe. No single body sees the whole system. Housing delivery requires coordination across zoning, planning approval, environmental assessment, transport planning, water and wastewater capacity, building standards, funding, and social housing delivery. In Ireland, responsibility for each step sits in a different organisation. No one has the authority to balance environmental goals, infrastructure constraints, housing need, and long-term strategy. This is why projects can disappear into bureaucratic limbo, not rejected, just slowly stalled. Systemic paralysis is common. Ireland's large infrastructure and housing projects frequently face long planning delays, inter-agency disputes, procedural errors, repeated assessments, and judicial reviews triggered by small oversights. Projects do not usually fail on their merits. They fail because the system makes it easy for them to stop and hard for them to progress. Agencies operate far from public accountability. Many state bodies involved in housing operate at arm's length from direct democratic oversight. For the public, it's often impossible to know who caused a delay, which agency objected, why a decision took years, or who can fix the problem. When responsibilities are opaque, accountability breaks down, and without accountability, systems move slowly. The outcome: multiple veto points, no ownership. When power is dispersed across many organisations, delays multiply, timelines stretch, costs rise, projects stall, and no one feels responsible for the final outcome. Ireland ends up with a system where everyone has a say, but no one is in charge. To fix this, Ireland needs more than policy adjustments. It needs visibility, a clear public-facing way to identify where projects are stuck and why. That brings us to one of the most important reforms: real-time transparency through a national housing delivery dashboard. When you step back and look at Ireland's housing system, the planning delays, infrastructure bottlenecks, cost pressures, labour shortages, and fragmented governance, one problem stands out. Ireland is flying blind. No one has a real-time, end-to-end view of what is actually happening, what is working, what is failing, or why projects quietly stall. That is why Ireland needs a national housing delivery dashboard, not as a public relations exercise, but as a tool of public accountability, because if you cannot measure a system, you cannot fix it. At the moment, housing delivery is process-driven, not results-driven. We do not clearly track how many homes are genuinely delivered, split between those built to rent and purchase, and broken down county by county. We do not see which projects are blocked and why, which agencies are responsible for delays, or how long each stage of delivery really takes. A national dashboard would publish these indicators openly and transparently, forcing the entire system to focus on delivery rather than paperwork. It would allow the public to track planning performance in real time, showing average decision times compared to legal targets, permissions that have never progressed, appeals volumes by county, the number and outcomes of judicial reviews, objections from state bodies, and the time between permission and construction. Patterns would become impossible to hide. If one county consistently takes 3 times longer than another, everyone would see it instantly. The dashboard would also reveal the true state of housing availability and affordability, showing how many homes are available to rent or buy compared with local population, median prices measured against local wages, social housing waiting lists, vacancy and dereliction levels, homelessness figures, and the supply of cost rental homes. Today, this information is scattered across departments and buried in reports, but a dashboard would finally put everything in one place. It would also expose infrastructure bottlenecks by showing wastewater capacity against demand, stop notices currently in effect, water connection, wait times, stalled upgrades, derelict sites by council, and the enforcement of derelict site levies and compulsory purchase powers. For the first time, Ireland could clearly see where development is blocked and why. Because housing is not built by policy, it is built by people. The dashboard would also track the size of the construction workforce, apprenticeship enrolments and completions, training backlogs, the adoption of modular building and domestic manufacturing capacity for prefab homes. Ireland would finally be able to spot labour shortages early and in the specific skills that matter. With real-time data, Ireland could detect bottlenecks early, target investment precisely, hold agencies accountable, reward strong performance, expose inefficiencies, rebuild public trust, and most importantly, accelerate housing delivery. This is not a cosmetic reform. It is the foundation that makes every other housing reform work, because Ireland cannot fix a system it cannot see. Ireland's housing crisis isn't the product of one mistake. It's the result of multiple long-term weaknesses colliding at the same time. For decades, construction capacity shrank, planning slowed, infrastructure lagged, costs rose, and the state withdrew from direct building. Each issue made the others worse, until the system could no longer provide enough homes at an affordable price. The result is a market where too few homes are built, too slowly, at too high a cost, and where ordinary workers are left competing for whatever remains. Fixing this requires more than short-term schemes. It means structural reform, modern infrastructure, a faster and more predictable planning system, large-scale public housing delivery, a more productive construction sector, clearer governance, and full transparency on where projects succeed or fail. Housing affects everything: economic competitiveness, family stability, well-being, and Ireland's ability to plan for the future. The choices made now will determine whether the next generation can build a life here. Ireland has solved big challenges before. It can do so again, but only if it confronts the structural issues directly and builds a system capable of delivering homes at the speed and scale the country needs.